February 23, 1945. A cave complex beneath Maruyama Plateau, Iwo Jima. Major Yoshio Tanaka sat with his back against volcanic rock still warm from the island's interior heat, a notebook balanced on his knee, and wrote by the light of a shielded lantern. Outside, less than 400 meters away, the flag had gone up on Suribachi that morning. Tanaka had watched it through a firing slit, and he did not write about the flag. He wrote about the men who had put it there. "They come as if death has already been negotiated with," he recorded in his field journal, in a passage recovered nearly intact after the battle. "I have fought the Chinese at Nanking and the British at Singapore. I have never seen infantry advance like this, not recklessly, but as though fear itself had been surgically removed and something colder installed in its place." That single line, scrawled in a cave by a man who had less than 3 weeks left to live, is the emotional center of everything that follows, because this is not the sanitized version of Iwo Jima. This is not the flag-raising photograph, the war bond poster, the version scrubbed clean for newsreels and postcards. This is the version written by the men who were trying to kill the Marines and could not understand why it wasn't working. Tanaka was not a green officer prone to exaggeration. Before Iwo Jima, he had served 11 years in the Imperial Japanese Army, beginning with the assault on Nanking in 1937, continuing through the Malayan Campaign and the fall of Singapore in early 1942, and finally landing on Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944 as part of the accelerated garrison buildup under General Tadamichi Kurabayashi. He had watched British colonial troops break and surrender by the tens of thousands. He had watched Chinese conscripts scatter under artillery they'd never trained against. He knew what broken formations looked like, what rooted men sounded like, what fear did to discipline. He had never, in 11 years, filed a report describing an enemy the way he described the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions in the last weeks of February 1945. To understand why Tanaka's testimony carried the weight it did, both to the officers who read it in 1945 and to the historians who recovered it decades later, you have to understand what the Marines who landed on Iwo Jima actually were, not as a symbol. As an institution built with specific intent over specific years by men who had thought very carefully about what kind of soldier they wanted to produce. The doctrine traces back to Paris Island and San Diego, to a training philosophy that had calcified into near-religious conviction by 1944, that a Marine rifleman should be able to operate effectively even after his unit ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Brigadier General Merritt Edson, who had helped shape amphibious assault doctrine after his own brutal experience on Guadalcanal's Bloody Ridge, put it to a class of officer candidates in 1943 in a line that would circulate informally through training commands for the rest of the war. "I do not want men who follow orders. I want men who, when the man giving the orders is dead, already know what the orders would have been." That philosophy, decentralized initiative married to absolute unit cohesion, was not theoretical by the time the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions boarded transports for Iwo Jima. It had already been tested and refined through Tarawa, through Saipan, through Peleliu, each battle feeding lessons back into training pipelines with brutal efficiency. The Marine who waded ashore at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, was the product of 3 years of iterative institutional learning, built specifically to survive the kind of defense-in-depth warfare that Kurabayashi had perfected on this island. Kurabayashi himself understood this. He had studied in the United States, had traveled through Kansas and Washington, D.C. as a young officer, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not underestimate American resolve. He had ordered his roughly 21,000 defenders to abandon the traditional banzai charge, the doctrine of dying gloriously in a single suicidal rush, and instead dig in. 17 kilometers of tunnels, reinforced concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-registered on every beach approach. His plan was not to stop the Marines at the water's edge. His plan was to make every meter of volcanic sand cost more than the last, until the invasion became politically unsustainable back in Washington. It should have worked. On paper, it should have worked. The Marines landed at 9:02 a.m. on February 19th into sand so soft and steep that vehicles bogged down within feet of the surf line, turning the beachhead into a stationary target gallery for Japanese guns that had been sighted in for months. Within the first hour, casualties climbed past anything the planners had projected. By nightfall on D-Day alone, more than 2,400 Marines were dead or wounded, and the island's defenders had barely begun to use their strongest positions. This is where the individual stories begin, not as decoration, but because the campaign literally cannot be told any other way. Iwo Jima was not won by divisions. It was won by small groups of exhausted men making decisions 11 meters from a pillbox, decisions nobody above the rank of corporal was in a position to order. Corporal Daniel Restivo, 20 years old, of Providence, Rhode Island, landed with the 5th Marine Division on Red Beach 1 on the first morning. His platoon lost its lieutenant to a mortar round before noon. Restivo, who had enlisted at 17 with his mother's forged signature and had never held a rank higher than corporal, found himself the senior man among 9 survivors pinned against a low sand ridge with a Japanese machine gun nest working the beach in interlocking arcs. Accounts differ slightly on exactly how long they were pinned. Some survivors later recalled 20 minutes, others closer to 40, but every account agrees on what happened next. Restivo crawled forward alone, using dead ground invisible from the gun's firing slit, and destroyed the position with 2 grenades thrown from a distance his own men estimated afterward at less than 10 feet. When a war correspondent later asked him about it for a stateside paper, Restivo reportedly said only, "Somebody had to move first, I was just closest." Private First Class Harold Beckwith, 19, of Muncie, Indiana, spent February 21st and 22nd as a stretcher bearer, making 11 trips across ground still under sporadic sniper fire to bring wounded men off the exposed slopes near Airfield No. 1. He was shot through the meat of his left shoulder on his 9th trip and taped the wound himself with medical tape from a fallen corpsman's kit rather than go to the rear, because in his own words, recorded in a 1987 oral history interview, "There were still fellas out there and I already knew the ground." Sergeant Wallace Bud Kerrigan, 24, of Butte, Montana, a mining town boy who had worked the copper shafts before enlisting, used skills nobody had trained him for to identify and mark 3 separate tunnel entrances near the base of Suribachi that combat engineers had missed entirely. Correctly guessing their locations from subtle shifts in ground vegetation and airflow patterns he recognized from underground work. His letter home to his sister 2 days before the flag went up on Suribachi contained a single understated line that survived in family records. "Ma would say I finally found a use for all that time underground." He was killed 6 days later clearing a bunker near the Mariama Plateau, one of the last actions of the northern advance. Private George Alvarez, 18, of El Paso, Texas, the youngest of the 4, was credited by his squad with single-handedly suppressing a Japanese heavy machine gun for nearly 10 minutes using only a Browning automatic rifle and the cover of a shattered aircraft revetment, buying time for his platoon to flank and destroy the position. He survived the battle, was wounded twice more before the island was declared secure on March 26, and when a fellow veteran asked him decades later what he remembered most, Alvarez didn't describe the fighting at all. He described the sound the volcanic sand made under his boots, a sound, he said, he still heard sometimes at night, 40 years later, in a bedroom in Texas a world away from that beach. These were not exceptional men by any biographical measure before the war. A forged enlistment, a mining town, a border city, a factory town in Indiana. What made them exceptional was what the institution had done to them in the preceding 18 months, and what happened when that training met an enemy who had built the most sophisticated defensive network the Pacific War had yet seen, and watched it fail to break the men attacking it. It is this specific phenomenon that Japanese officers began trying, with increasing desperation, to explain in writing during the final 2 weeks of the battle. An intelligence officer attached to Kurabayashi's staff, identified in post-war recovered documents only by his surname Ishikawa, coined a phrase that appeared in at least 2 separate captured reports. Tekigen no Ishi, roughly. The enemies will made stone. Ishikawa used the term to describe what he characterized as a psychological anomaly. American Marines in his analysis appeared to experience combat stress and casualties as reinforcing factors rather than degrading ones, the opposite of every model Japanese training doctrine assumed about enemy morale under sustained losses. Conventional theory holds that an attacking force loses cohesion in proportion to casualties suffered, Ishikawa wrote. Observation here suggests the opposite curve. Cohesion appears to increase as casualties mount, up to a threshold we have not yet located. Another document, believed to have originated from a company-level defensive position near the base of Suribachi and recovered by Marine intelligence after the position fell, used a cruder but equally telling phrase. High ninja, not human, not as dehumanizing propaganda, but apparently as a genuine attempt at battlefield analysis, an officer trying to explain to his own superiors why standard defensive doctrine, which had held against every other Allied force in the Pacific, was failing here specifically. The margin note is perhaps the most striking artifact of all. On a captured tactical report describing the loss of a fortified position near the airfield, an unidentified senior officer, believed by historians to be a staff officer reviewing the report for Kurabayashi's headquarters, wrote a single line in the margin in handwriting distinct from the report itself. Read this twice. I do not think the author is exaggerating. The climax of the campaign, and the moment that crystallizes everything Tanaka, Ishikawa, and the unnamed staff officer were struggling to articulate, came on March 8th and 9th near the northern edge of the island, in the fighting around a fortified ravine the Marines had nicknamed, without irony, the Gorge. It was here that the remnants of Kurabayashi's command made their final coordinated stand, a network of caves and interlocking gun positions that Japanese defenders believed correctly, based on every prior engagement of the war, was unassailable by direct infantry assault. The 5th Marine Division took it anyway, in fighting so close that flamethrower operators and riflemen were engaging targets less than 15 meters apart, cave mouth to cave mouth, for nearly 18 continuous hours. Marine casualties in the gorge alone exceeded any single-day total since the initial landing. And yet the assault did not stall. Companies that lost 70% of their officers within the first 3 hours continued to advance under sergeants and corporals who, per Edson's doctrine years earlier, already knew what the orders would have been. Major Tanaka did not survive to write about the gorge. Records place his death on approximately March 6, 2 days before that final assault began, in fighting near the plateau he had been observing from his cave position weeks earlier. He was 31 years old. His journal, the one containing the passage that opens this account, was recovered by a Marine intelligence team in late March and eventually made its way, through a series of translations and archival transfers, into post-war historical record, one of a small number of Japanese personal documents from Iwo Jima to survive intact. What he could not have known, writing by lantern light in a cave 3 weeks before his death, was how thoroughly his instinct would be confirmed not just by the battle's outcome but by the numbers themselves. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, fewer than 1,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Of the nearly 70,000 Marines who fought there, more than 6,800 were killed and over 19,000 wounded, the highest casualty rate the Marine Corps suffered in any battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later write that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue among the Americans who fought there, a line that has become, over 8 decades, almost too familiar to feel its original weight. But familiarity is not the same as understanding. Tanaka understood something in that cave that the poster version of the story tends to lose, that the men climbing those beaches were not fearless. They were afraid, exhausted, badly led in places, poorly supplied, and dying in numbers that should have broken any fighting force built on ordinary discipline. What Tanaka saw, what Ishikawa tried and failed to fully name, what the unnamed staff officer read twice and could not dismiss, was not the absence of fear. It was something built to function despite it, a doctrine of institutional will distributed down to the level of a 19-year-old corpsman taping his own gunshot wound because there were still men out there and he already knew the ground. The Marines did not win Iwo Jima because they didn't feel the same terror the men in Kurabayashi's tunnels felt watching them come. They won it because 3 years of deliberate institutional design had built something into them that outlasted the terror, something that a Japanese defensive doctrine, sophisticated as it was, had never encountered before and, per its own internal reports, could not fully explain even as it was losing to it. Takagun no Ishi, the enemies will made stone. It is a phrase written by a man trying to describe an institution he did not fully understand. From inside a cave he would not leave alive. And it is perhaps as precise a description as exists of what the United States Marine Corps had spent 3 years of war deliberately building, not fearlessness, but will. Not the absence of breaking, but something engineered to hold past the point where breaking should have occurred. Unbreakable was never the right word for what the Japanese officers who fought at Iwo Jima were describing. It suggests something rigid, something that simply does not bend. What they were actually describing, in journals, in margin notes, in coined phrases that never made it into any pre-war textbook, was something closer to a will that had been built to keep moving forward even after it had already been broken over and over, on a beach of black volcanic sand that offered no cover and asked no permission. That is the story the flag on Suribachi never tells on its own. That is the story written not by the men who raised it, but by the men who watched them do it, and could not explain in any doctrine they had ever studied how they had managed to survive long enough to climb that far.